All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Zoom briefing for allied health HP/social worker psychologist employees of the Department of Education. My name's Dee Spink. I'm the Assistant Secretary of Together, and it's my great privilege to be working with our members in the Department of Education this year as you are going through your bargaining process. We also have a number of delegates here with us today who I'll introduce a bit later, and you'll hear directly from some of those delegates today as well. So thank you for joining us. We think it's a really great opportunity to bring you up to speed as to where we are at with bargaining, explain the process holistically a little bit, and then talk more specifically about the claims that are relevant to your cohort. So we do have, I think we have a chat function that is open. We've also got a Q&A function, so we'll try to monitor that throughout the process as well. But please, if you do have any questions that we weren't able to get to or any comments, please email us at education@together.org.au and we can follow up out of session as well. So before we go any further, I of course would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting today. For me in South Brisbane, that is the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander with us today. And I apologise if you can hear in South Brisbane, we've got the flyover for the practice for river fire happening. So if you're hearing any disconcerting noise in the background, that's it, but hopefully that is done by now. So for some of you, and you'll certainly hear from Alicia later, but I did want to introduce some of the delegates that we have online today and some of the people who were really key in making sure that we could bring everyone here to talk about your specific issues as this specific cohort within the Department of Education. So we have a number of delegates online today, including Alicia Spackman, Rosalind Kaur, Paul Hunt, and Sue Ennis. I'm sure Alicia and maybe Ros will touch on this later as well, but I think we just want to acknowledge first up as well that of course we have a number of disciplines who are represented in this delegate group currently, but we don't have delegates necessarily from across every discipline that is now employed by the department. So really keen to have representation from these groups. So please don't hesitate to reach out either through this process today or afterwards. We'd love to have a chat to you about how you might be able to become a bit more active, particularly I think our social work and psychologist members who are newer cohorts to the department. So very keen to have a chat to you if you're interested about how we can make sure that you are being best represented, particularly throughout this bargaining process as well as newer roles in the department. So just very briefly before I do hand over to Alicia, I wanted to give you a broad overview of collective bargaining, because I know for some of you this is probably, old hat, you've done this before. For others, this may be the first time that you've been part of a collective bargaining process, particularly here in the public service. So how collective bargaining works, I guess even taking a step back from that, collective bargaining is the process whereby you can improve your wages and conditions here in the public service. And it's really the only way that you can do that. It's not as if, of course, the Department of Education, I think, has about 93,000 employees across the state. So generally speaking, you can't bowl up to the Director General's office and say, I would like a pay rise, please. It's not that sort of approach that we have to have in an agency as large as education. So that's where the collective bargaining process comes in. Generally speaking, every 3 years or so, union members get together to put together the log of claims, which Alicia and the other delegates will talk through more specifically for your particular cohort of employees. But the log of claims, in essence, is what we want to see changed as part of this bargaining process. So hopefully many of you who are online will have gone through the log of claims survey process earlier in the year. We had a number of therapist delegates present at our delegate conference earlier in this year to really finalise the log of claims, and hopefully for all of those who are online, you have seen the full log of claims as well. We can certainly send a link out to that when we send the recording of this out as well. So the log of claims, yep, essentially what we want to see changed. So where we are at now, when you refer to the little cartoon that we have here, of course, we have been attending negotiations. I'll talk a bit more in detail about negotiations next, but we've had delegates sitting around the table with the employer for a good number of weeks now. We have also, of course, and hopefully many of you in your schools or your regional offices, you might have had some conversations with our organisers who are out visiting work sites, talking directly to members and potential members about what's happening, what's going on the ground, getting your feedback, keeping you in the loop. So we are in both the negotiation and the campaign phase when it comes to the Department of Education EB. This week, your EB actually expired. So it expired on the 31st of August. And the reason that that date is important is because for union members, after the expiry of your agreement, you have access to a process called protected industrial action. We probably will talk an awful lot about that today, but please do, particularly if you are a union member, please do keep an eye on your emails and the other communications that you're getting from the union office over the next little while and into the start of term 4, because that's certainly something that we want to hear from members about. I guess, broadly speaking, when we talk about protected industrial action, the reason for that is to really help balance the power imbalance that exists between workers and their employer. So it's about coming together collectively as a union group to say, okay, if your employer is not saying yes to the claims that you feel very strongly about, what are we going to do to put a little bit of pressure on them to ensure that they can actually see how strongly and how widely felt that issue is. So we probably won't talk too much more about that today. But again, for union members in particular, please do keep an eye out on your emails and other forms of communication with the union office, because it is something that, unfortunately, not always will your employer come to the table and say, absolutely, we agree with everything you've asked for, here you go. More often than not, we do have to put a bit of pressure on your employer to actually come to the table with a decent offer that actually improves your working life. So yeah, let's put a pin in that for today, but just please do keep an eye on your communications, and of course have a chat to your delegates about that, and any questions come through to the union office as well. So just very briefly, and hopefully most people are aware of this change to the wages policy that union members were successful in winning earlier this year. So prior to the state budget in June, the wages policy was 2.5% per annum for the life of the agreement. After a combined union campaign across the public service, union members were very successful in challenging that and changing it significantly to 4%, 4%, 3% over the life of the agreement. Obviously, when we look at inflation, particularly in Brisbane, that doesn't necessarily reach inflation. So a component of that is also a one-off inflation adjustment. So for instance, if, let's say, just as an example, inflation were to stay at, let's say, 6% for until the next March quarter, I believe, that would mean that in addition to that 4% base increase to your salary, you'd also get a 2% increase of your salary as a one-off payment. So if you do have any questions about that, please feel free to get in touch with the union office, but also some really great work done by union members to change that. And just very quickly in regards to negotiations, so we have been having weekly negotiations with departmental representatives called the Single Bargaining Unit. Frustratingly, particularly now that we are at the point where your EB has expired, there are no bargaining frameworks that have been approved for the Department of Education, but also the Department of Health and many of your other colleagues across the public service who are renegotiating their agreements this year. So if you're an eagle-eyed union member, you might have seen an email from our Secretary Alex Scott yesterday afternoon where we are calling on the Treasurer to actually allow negotiations to happen properly, because certainly from a union perspective, our members are turning up weekly. They are working through the issues, but we're met essentially with, that's nice, you know, I can't actually engage with you around that, but thank you for explaining that, which, as you can imagine, is quite a frustrating process. And we're really keen to make sure that people are getting money in their pockets as soon as possible, and we can as soon as possible, but we simply can't do that without a permanent framework from government. And just very, very quickly, and then I will hand over to Alicia. Sorry, Alicia. You know, how do we win through bargaining? And I know that those of you who are online who were part of the last agreement know this very well, because you had some very significant wins. And you did that through focusing on, you know, these three key things. So having active and engaged members, having delegate and activist networks, and focusing on the widely and deeply felt issues. And we know that is a formula for success. And this group is a really good example of that as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to one of your wonderful delegates, Alicia Spackman. Thank you, Alicia.
Very welcome. Thanks, Dee. So first thing I want to start off is kind of just to reiterate Dee's caveat there that I feel quite able to represent OT, all right with physio, speechy okay, psychologist not yet. So if you are in there and you're thinking about it, you're a psychologist, please consider getting in contact with the union about how you can advocate for your profession. And you'll hear a bit more about why we're including the social work in a minute. But if any of you have ever met me, you know that I have a tendency to go big picture here. And if I get you to go to the next slide, Dee, I really want to draw your attention to what we're all here for. So as a Department of Education employee, we're all here to support a great future for every Queenslander, which I take to mean as it's our job to support kids in schools to have a good life beyond school. Now, if you go to the second page and there's those 6 sections, I'm probably going to ignore the racing section because that's probably not relevant, but I am going to draw your attention to the one above it, a fair and safe workplace and community. So promoting fair pay and safe working conditions that create stability and confidence for a strong economy. So why I'm saying this is that our union work is part of our work. So what we're doing here to have a great future for all Queenslanders is thinking about how to make our place a good workplace to support the kids that we support every day. So if you've done some light bedtime reading, this is the log of claims. And as Dee said, what we've done so far is we've had one meeting with the department where essentially we moved through these claims and explained them and to get them to understand what we're on about. And that's what I'm going to do today. So when we think about this first claim around social workers to be translated to the HP stream, the reasoning behind this is that in Queensland Health, they are recognised as HP, that they're not in ours. And they have the same professional requirements that are outlined in our EB that apply to us as OTs, physios and speech and psychologists. And also that there is statewide representation of social work. So there's this PO6 position that sits at a statewide level for them. The next two I kind of grouped together there because that second one has a few pieces within it. So ensuring transparent supervision ratios and transparency regarding allocation of therapy and wellbeing resources. So the idea being behind this one is that we're considering how much time for HP for each region, for each discipline and at what level. So how's that decision made? Every region sits eagerly at the end of the year wondering, waiting for how much FTE we're going to be able to employ to next year. How's that decision made? And when you think about it in terms of clinical supervision, the psychology have, with the wellbeing package, have a ratio of 10% is sort of the reasoning behind that one, whereas we're not actually sure what the decision making is behind the clinical supervision allocations for OT, PT and speech. And if, like, I can use Metro as an example because that's the numbers I know, but we have 1.2 FTE senior advisor time to 35 people / 23 FTE. So in terms of the workload associated with that, having transparency around that would be pretty good too. And for the speechies, because they have a lot of purchase time, so not only the money that they're funded through regionally, they have schools directly purchase them. There currently is no requirement for there to be a part of that funding that sits for senior advisor supervision time. So they just have to supervise more people on the same amount of time. This one here is more about this second point. So in line with growth in student enrolment, NCCD data and numbers of student with disability. So particularly for OT and physio, for a long time, our target cohort has been sitting under those 6 EAP categories. And there's been broad recognition that that wasn't wide enough, that there was an inequality of access for kids who sat outside those 6 categories. But the question here is, how do you balance inclusion and equity of access to service with feasible workloads? So particularly for the OT physios, it's a massive broadening in scope of practice because it now captures more types of disability. And so that increase in eligible cohort. So again, I'll use Metro numbers because they're what I know. But in Metro, there's about 10,000 kids who would qualify under EAP. We don't see all 10,000, but to give you an idea of the increase, there's about 32,000 in terms of NCCD. So really considering how do we balance that equity of access with feasible workloads. So on the next slide, I sort of wanted to touch upon the different.
Sorry, Alicia, it's Roz here. I just wanted to go back to that last slide and say, we know within this discussion, we don't know what that target cohort for OT and physio for next year is going to be. So a lot of this is done with that caveat of, we don't know what that target cohort's going to be, but there's a good anticipation that it's going to increase. That we can already see that through our special considerations process. We're already seeing kids who weren't under EAP and that's going to increase. So we don't know what that target cohort is, but that's something we also raised with the department when they said, oh, no, you're basically going to be seeing the same students. We went, no, we're not. We already know we're seeing kids who weren't picked up under EAP through the special considerations process. So, it is going to increase. We don't know what it's going to increase to, but we know there's going to be an increase and we need our staffing numbers to increase because we're already struggling to provide a service to the students who do fall within our target cohort, let alone all those other ones. So,
thanks, Roz. In this one, I just wanted to touch upon the different funding mechanisms. So for the psychologists and the social workers, they're funded through the Wellbeing Package, which is a 3-year initiative with, I can't remember the exact amount of money. But the question is, what happens after that 3 years? How do you think about the sustainability of that workforce? And if you're going to be long-term employees of the department, what's your future? What's your career structure and progression and things like that? For the OTs, physios, speech, we're all funded by the Student with Disability Resourcing Model, but the speeches are also funded by the Whole School Support Student Learning Resources, or WISLR. And why I bring that up is because it shows the difference in scope of service delivery. So speeches have been working within the whole school approach, so thinking about service in the differentiated, focused and intensive tiers for a long time, and their funding reflects that. Whereas we're only funded with students with disability, and in the last 3 years with our change in model of service delivery to work within the whole school approach, our funding hasn't reflected that. So to give you numbers, in Metro, again, OT, 23 FTE, physio, 22 FTE, no explanation why there's a difference, by the way, and speech is 60. So that's a difference in the way that you're funded, which impacts how much work you can do in the different tiers of service delivery. And to add to that, there's an additional 32 FTE that schools have purchased for speech, which really speaks to why are they feeling the need to purchase more, and that's a recognition of the need. This one's about resources. So we have different resource grants, like say the RASA grant, that these haven't been indexed to inflation since they were built. Well, we theorise since they're built. We can't find the data, but it's at least a decade. So that means that we've had, all this growth in inflation and things like that, but that resource number has stayed the same. And psychologists are not able to access those resources. So what is their access in the same way we have in terms of being able to purchase things that support their work?
And again, it's Roz here. We also raised the fact that there's no acknowledgement of therapists who work in the more remote regions. So the fact that for professional development, often they're paying out of their pocket because they can't afford in their resource grant as it stands to pay for flights and accommodation and meal allowances in order to go to Brisbane to access a PD that people in Brisbane can access with just paying the cost of attendance, or even if it's a free one, people in the more remote, and by remote I mean basically not in the southeast corner, those regions, even for free PDs, they're having to pay to get to them, and there's no acknowledgement of that in any of the resource allocation.
Thanks, Ross. This one speaks to this consistency of career structure across the different professions. So if we look at the next slide, now, this is my attempt at trying to visualize what happens with all the different levels across the different professions. You'll notice I've got nursing in there. We don't represent nurses. It's more just to show the representation that happens at the different levels. So nurses have statewide representation, as well as their regional seniors, as well as school-based nurses. In the same way, so does social work and psychology have that statewide representation. There's inconsistencies around how HP4 time is used. So you have two types of HP4 time. You have clinical and you have supervisory. So clinical is legacy. So in, I think, somewhere around 2008, 20 PO4 positions were allocated across OT, PT and speech, 10 to speech, 5 to OT, 5 to physio. There has been no more. So these positions were in recognition of clinical superiority, that you were a clinical senior OT, physio or speech. What happened was when there was a dissolution of Disability Services Unit in 2012, that we lost our statewide representation for OT, speech and physio, and that a lot of these HP4 clinical positions were moved across the region inconsistently. And so now, in order to get a HP4 clinical position, someone has to retire or leave the position. So there's been no new time in that space. I also think there's a bit of a gap in terms of that HP4 supervisory. Historically, there's been challenges in that people, particularly in the speech realm, would have HP4 supervisories doing the same job as HP5 supervisory. I think we now have the capacity to understand there's differences in the role and to really be able to provide career progression opportunities, not only in terms of just for people to have those opportunities to progress their peers, progress their careers, so you're not jumping from HP3 to HP5, but also to do the different levels of work so that the work is covered across it so we can do better work. That's it. So this one's around clinical education. So there's inconsistency across the different professions about how we support clinical education. And if you think about, there's a predicted shortage of 40% of allied health workforce in the next 3 to 4 years. Where does the future workforce come from? It comes from our students, and so we need to be able to host them. And what would help us to host them is to be able to have enhanced support of the mechanisms that help that. So, you know, is it a clinical educator coordinator, the position that Queensland Health have? Is it about having PD allowances that go directly to the practitioner like Queensland Health does? Even just reviewing that as a matter of urgency and sense of how we're going to get the workforce to do the job into the future. I've kind of already spoken to this one a little bit in this sense of what is the sustainable career structure in terms of the HP4 positions and the career progression opportunities, and like Ros sort of mentioned before around those rural and remote incentives. If there's anything else you want to add in this section, Ros?
Yeah, so not so much around the HP4 positions, I guess, from a rural and remote position. It's more around the recruitment to the regions, which I think is a different slide.
No, Ros, there's no more slides after this one.
Cool.
So
all
do
right.
it now.
So something that we're coming up, and it's not just around the therapist, so this is something that Dee is addressing more from the whole public servant structure, is the incentives for rural and remote employees within the department. There aren't any. So as I was mentioned before, we don't have any additional grants for those people who need to travel for professional development. Up until 2 years ago, everyone in the department who worked in certain areas was eligible for housing, and 2 years ago the department, without any notice, changed the policy to teacher housing, and so we no longer, therapists no longer have access to reduced subsidised housing. Our technicians, our admin people, nobody gets access to subsidised housing in the department except for teachers, whereas up until 2 years ago, everybody did. So that's been a real struggle for recruiting to a lot of these areas. We can't use it as an incentive anymore. The fact that teachers get race days or RAS days, RAIS, so teachers get additional days off, additional leave days for living in rural and remote areas to allow them to travel back to Brisbane or into the cities for medical appointments and for social reasons as well. And again, nobody else has access to those. Teacher aides get additional time in the holidays, additional subsidised days that nobody else gets. So there's some of those rural and remote incentives and just basic incentives within the department that have been inequitably allocated between different professions and different EBs. So that's something else that, as a whole union thing, not just as as for the therapists, but for that rural and remote attraction issues that we're having. We know we're having issues attracting to lots of areas, and we know that there's a predicted workforce shortage in the next 4 years across the country. But if we can't address that from a rural and remote place point of view, we're not going to ever attract people back out here. So those are just some of the additional things that are sitting on the wider claims within the this whole bargaining process.
I think too, it's important to note that link with the clinical education there in terms of rural and remote attraction and retention, in terms of, you know, if you have people who are from these places, they're more likely to want to work there, but we need to host them and they need to know about the jobs.
If we can have students out here, then they're more likely to go, oh, hey, actually, it's not quite so scary to go and have a job in Emerald or Mount Isa or, you know, any of those places. You actually, there is a lot of supports out there, and it is actually quite a fun place to go and work. But if we can't attract the students, or we can't support the students on placement, then we're never going to attract them as professionals unless they come from out here, let's be honest.
The last slide this is quite detailed, this one. This one is about the, so some of you know about the restrictive practice procedure, and that it outlines the different types of restrictive practice and the roles encompassed within it. In particular, this one's about mechanical restraint, I would argue, in terms of clinical holding as well. But the purpose of a mechanical restraint is to reduce self-injurious behaviour and to prescribe a mechanical restraint. It needs to be done by an appropriate qualified health professional, which in the department's view is us. But the argument here is, what is the skill set required for that, and do we have it? And so this is about really trying to figure out what is best practice for preventing self-injurious behaviour, and what is the role of OT and PT in this space, in order so that we can actually do best practice and ideally not use mechanical restraint. So it's about that needs analysis. Do we have the skills to be able to do it? And if we do, then how do we upskill to be good at it? And if we don't, where does it go then? So that's what we're here for. This is part of our job, to be able to make this workplace a better place to be in, to learn in and to grow in. So on the next slide here, the union is your voice. If you're not a member already, please consider that this is what makes changes. We had such amazing traction last time in what we were able to achieve. The work we did meant that we're now on parity with Queensland Health and we can attract people. The clinical governance guidelines in terms of what we can provide and supervision is phenomenal. And we need to consider what's next to make sure that we can attract and keep people in this job, because it is good.
Thanks, Alicia. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. So we'll probably wrap up here. We have been recording this session as well, so if you're speaking to any of your co-workers who had hoped to make it, we'll be able to distribute that. And I'm so sorry, we do have one of the delegates. I'm not sure which of our delegates, they're under my name apparently, but please do go ahead, whoever it is who has their hand up.
Hi there, it's Paul here.
Paul, thank you. Go ahead.
And thank you everyone for your input this morning. Dee, I was just wondering whether you might just outline what happens from here in terms of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Paul. So while we do have some frustrations at the moment in terms of the negotiation side of things because of a lack of bargaining framework, and I was a bit remiss at the start not to mention that the Department of Education, of course, is one of many EBs that are up for renegotiation this year. So literally everybody who is employed by the Department of Education, teachers, teacher aides, cleaners, and of course school support staff, and of course it's also School Support Staff Recognition Week next week. So please do take a moment next week to celebrate your good work. So everybody is up for renegotiation. Some unions have had more success in terms of getting an outcome, even though in those instances, for instance, with the nurses and the teachers, there are still holdups because that bargaining framework has not yet been approved by government centrally. So we'll continue pushing that and trying to ensure that government centrally understands how important it is for these negotiations to happen properly at a departmental level. And I should say, while we are, I described them as frustrating previously, we should say they are proceeding in, a very respectful way. The people who are sitting around the table are trying the best within the limitations that they have industrially, but it is also, I think, quite disrespectful that for a significant swathe of the public service, we are now past the expiry of your ED and you don't have the ability to actually do that negotiation. So in terms of next steps, our delegates have had a couple of discussions about what we might seek to do if we don't have an offer from the department on the table. I'd be really keen, and I've had this discussion with a couple of delegates, to ask for the department specifically to give us a response before the end of term to say, where are we at? I would anticipate that there won't be a fulsome offer on the table at that point. So at that point, we would then be coming out to our members and saying, so we're a couple of weeks out from expiry. We have access as union members to this process called protected industrial action. Is this something that you would like to do? And if so, what is it that you would like to do to put some pressure on your employer? So that might be something like work bans. There is stop work available under that as well. And at the end of the day, it's union members making the decision about that. And it's union members who make the decision about when to take any sort of protected industrial action. And it also, really importantly, it's union members who actually make the difference there, because when we can show, like we did with our therapists last time around, that you are strong, you are united, you are the majority, you get results. So I think, as Alicia wrapped up as well, just really encourage people, if you're not yet a member, or if you're speaking to some of your co-workers who aren't yet members, it is a really important time to be active in this process, and the way that you do that is by being. I hope that explained. Is that what you were after, Paul?
Yeah, that's great. Just so everyone has a bit of a handle on, where to from here, basically.
Yeah. And we'll continue doing those weekly updates about negotiations as well on our member board too. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again so much for your time, and thank you so much to your delegates who do all of the heavy lifting and also had the great idea to do this briefing. So we will be in touch. We'll probably send an email out to all of the participants today. So if there was a question that we weren't able to get to, or if there's something that you thought about afterwards, just respond to that email, and we'll have either myself or one of my team get in touch with you. And of course, I know our delegates are very approachable as well. So if you want to have any conversations with them, I'm sure they will make themselves available. But yeah, thanks again. And please do be in touch if you've got any questions, and look forward to continuing to work.